Sandy Cioffi, you have on your website an interview between ABC's Brian Ross and Mend leader. Explain why that's there.
Because in December of 2006, when I was going back to interview one of the heads of Mend really has 5 heads. And everyone on the ground, including regular women and children, know this. But people in the international press seemed to glom on to one leader, and it was a pseudonym name, it was an email name, Jomo Bomo. And all the attention was going to Jomo Bomo. And it struck me as suspicious that the person who was writing the most incendiary language that could be used for a narrative that Mend is simply a terrorist organization was getting all the international attention. So when I went there as a freelance person doing the documentary, I was also there shooting for ABC News. The original agreement was that I would be in a hotel room in Warri, Brian Ross would be in New York on the phone and interview him. This was the first person in Mend unmasked to identify himself on international television and say, "I am Mend." It was very brave, and it was a very difficult thing for him to do. ABC chose to leave that footage on the floor, and the story they went with instead was simply an email chat with Jomo Bomo calling for blowing up car bombs and pipes, etc. And the reason I placed the interview on the website is you can see that Brian's asking this guy, whose name is Paul, over and over again, do you have hostages? Where do you get your guns? Are you going to blow anything up? Might you consider doing that tomorrow? I mean, it almost seems like a Saturday Night Live skit. It's quite surreal. So, I mean, I wouldn't purport that Brian has a particular agenda in the Niger Delta. I just think it was a classic example of the mainstream media going towards the sensational rather than the complexity of a place that is quite literally hanging in the balance. And how these stories are told will impact how they turn out.
The Bush administration has been pushing to establish AFRICOM, forces in Africa. Explain how that fits into the oil-rich Niger Delta.
Oh, it fits in very much. It's a very important story. The Gulf of Guinea is the water that's right off the coast of Nigeria, where there is, by some estimates, more than 10 times the untapped oil that's in Saudi Arabia. And the AFRICOM base is proposed for Nigeria. So what I think part of the narrative that we have to be very careful about right now is this idea that Mend and the corruption mean this place is just an intractable mess, and without some greater level of U.S. Pentagon intervention, we won't have the kind of stability there we need. I'd also like to point out that oil production is down by 30% in the last 2 years. Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News are naming now the Niger Delta militants as typically a number 1 or 2 reason for the increase in the price of oil. I think that the sad truth is that Mend has known this, and that's why their tactics have been violent, because it's the first and only time in a decade they've gotten any kind of attention for the story.
Can you talk about the companies that are there? When Democracy Now! Then producer Jeremy Scahill and I went to the Niger Delta in 1998, we focused on Chevron and did this documentary, Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. Ken Saro-Wiwa, the well-known Nigerian Ogoni activist, died taking on Shell in his area of the Niger Delta in Ogoni land. What are the companies now?
Well, some of the very same suspects. Shell's the largest oil company in the Niger Delta, but Chevron is substantial, and it's an American-held company, and I think that for this audience that makes it really significant. I'll say that I actually think this is a unique moment with the oil companies. It's not to say they are not culpable in large part for where we are, and it's bizarre to listen to oil company executives portray their situation as if they're powerless. They talk about this moment in the Niger Delta as if they're on the other end of something horrible happening to them. That said, because of the instability and because of this current moment, and when I say current moment, I mean the escalation in both the real violence and the potential of violence, they're actually at least indicating an interest in being brought to the table as one of the stakeholders in a real mediation. I think they would like the appearance of being forced into doing that, and not that I necessarily trust Chevron to be a great player in the future, but I do think that they would be a better player than some of the other oil companies, particularly from China, for example, that have already indicated that they'd love to come in and they have no concern about the human rights abuses in the Delta.
And finally, these oil companies posting record profits right now compared to the level of poverty for the people of the Niger Delta.
It's an unforgivable, and it's unconscionable. I don't know how we can deal with it any longer. When we were released from detention after a week, and I read the price of oil at that time had hit the all-time high of $119 a barrel, I had the realization that for the first time in my life, I'd paid the actual price of oil, that kind of denial of humanity that I only tasted, that the people there live with every day, it's unforgivable, and I do think that there's a solution. I think that it is possible that this is the time that both the oil companies and the Nigerian government can be held accountable to pay for what they've been pulling out of the ground all these years.
Sandy Cioffi, I want to thank you for being with us. Her film, Sweet Crude, will be out this summer. This is Democracy Now!, Democracy